Hey, it's Amber. Before we get started, I want you to know this episode contains references to suicide and depression, so please take that into consideration as you listen. If you want to avoid that part of the conversation, we've provided timestamps in the show notes. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. Help is available 24 hours a day in English or Spanish via the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Text or call them at 988 in the United States. Again, text or call 988 in the US. You can also check findahelpline.com to find help where you are. That's findahelpline.com.
When you add to that physical component, whereas elite athletes we're trained to tolerate physical pain, right? Like, it doesn't hurt. It's not that bad. I'm fine. Your limbs might be falling off. You might have like road rash up and down your body, but you're fine. You're fine. And just a scratch, just but a scratch. I mean, that's a wonderful mentality to have when you're out there on race day doing your thing. It can help you get to the finish line. And I love that. But it's also a switch that we need to be able to turn off when we're talking about things that are A, not race day oriented, or B, the mental health side of it too. Like, no, it's really not okay if you're coming apart at the seams, but you're like, no, the thread will hold. No, it's okay to sit down and restitch and rethread when necessary, but we're still figuring out in our culture how to do that and how to be like, it's okay. We, just like now, one of the things that I love is that I think in our modern athletic culture, especially with endurance sports, finally now in our culture, it's so acceptable to have rest days. And in training blocks, right, rest is now finally heralded as such an important part of the training equation. Because honestly, if you don't have a rest day, you don't recover, and then you can't build your next performance. So I think we need those mental health rest days as well. And when we can say, oh gosh, it's too much, my brain is too tired, I need to sit down and, stop thinking and stop worrying for a time, that needs to be built into our daily lives as well. Whether or not we're a professional athlete, but just saying, look, I'm going to take a mental health day today and do absolutely nothing, or knit 10 sweaters if that's what does it for you. Whatever it is that makes you feel relaxed and happy and like you're in a peaceful place. That I think we're slowly getting to realize that that's such an important thing to add into our calendars.
That's Kathryn Bertine speaking to the importance of proactively incorporating regular rest and recovery, not only to balance the stress of workouts and training, but also to balance the stress we impose on our brains. It's easy to forget how much mental energy we expend daily, and even easier to discount the signs of mental and emotional fatigue, to the detriment of our mental health. Kathryn, however, has learned to attune to the needs of her brain in ways most folks haven't had to learn. In 2016, this author, filmmaker, and activist had successfully published 3 books, had released an award-winning documentary, had lobbied one of the richest and most powerful sports organizations in the world to include women in the Tour de France for the first time since the 1980s, and had just entered her 4th year of racing professionally when she almost died in a race in La Paz, Mexico. The crash fractured her skull in 2 places, and she would not have survived had it not been for the determined medics on the scene. As she healed, she gained new appreciation for many things, not the least of which was tuning in to her brain's need for occasional rest, a perspective from which we can all learn. But this wouldn't be her last brush with death, as you'll soon hear. You're listening to the Be a Good Wheel podcast, the show where we explore what it means to be a good wheel by digging into scientific research and personal stories about human potential and performance. I'm your host, Amber Pierce. Today's guest brings a wealth of multifaceted insights from her equally multifaceted experiences. Kathryn Bertine is many things to many people. She's an author, athlete, activist, founder, and documentary filmmaker. She's also a steadfast friend and dedicated mentor. Her path to cycling is as non-traditional as they come. Working as a columnist and senior editor for ESPN, she took on a project that would change her life. In 2006, ESPN tasked Kathryn with attempting to qualify for the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing. The idea was that she would try different summer sports, then pick one and give it her best shot at qualifying for the Games. Part of the goal was to demonstrate the incredible level of Olympic athletes and generate content in the build-up to the event. But Kathryn possesses genuine athletic prowess. She had previously toured with the Ice Capades as a professional ice skater, the subject of her first book, All the Sundays Yet to Come. She was also a collegiate rower for her alma mater, Colgate University, and found remarkable success after casually picking up triathlon. For the ESPN project, she tried everything from handball to modern pentathlon. Even as a gifted athlete, it was a long shot to qualify for the Games in 2 years. That was part of the point. Kathryn approached the endeavor with genuine humility. Finding she had a real knack for the bike, she set her sights on road cycling, becoming an expert in the rules governing Olympic qualification. She applied for citizenship in the island country of St. Kitts and Nevis, in part to improve her chances of qualification, and in part because she had come to understand the unique qualification challenges facing smaller countries and wanted to use her visibility to shine a light on those inequities. She didn't qualify for the Olympics, but she did fall in love with the sport of cycling. She respected the heck out of the athletes forging their careers in the sport, and importantly, she came to care deeply about them. As she embarked on her own journey to the pro ranks, she not only experienced injustices, but also had a front row seat to similar experiences of other women in the sport. She ultimately raced 5 years as a professional cyclist in the World Tour Pro Circuit, and she did a lot more than race. She became a staunch advocate for athletes and cycling federations representing small countries, and more broadly, for women cyclists grappling with gross inequality. Not shy about taking action, she set her sights on one of the most visible and consequential examples of sexism in the sport, the exclusion of women in the Tour de France. Most of the biggest races in cycling included both men's and women's events, much like the Olympics or World Championships. The Tour de France, on the other hand, is the most visible, most lucrative race on the pro calendar and represents the pinnacle of the sport in which, at the time, women could not participate and could not therefore enjoy the accompanying media exposure and sponsorship opportunities. Back in the 80s, the Tour de France did include a women's event, so feasibility was clearly not the issue. She put together a business plan and emailed it to the race organizers. They didn't respond. But this is Kathryn, and she wasn't about to stop there. Determined to shed light on the substantial inequalities in the sport, she launched a grassroots fundraising campaign to make a film. A first-time filmmaker, she documented her persistent efforts with the Tour de France, as well as the experiences and resolve of her fellow racers, including me. The result was her award-winning documentary film, Half the Road: The Passion, Pitfalls, and Power of Women's Professional Cycling, which debuted in 2014. In 2020, the film was named one of the best cycling films of all time and continues to be screened worldwide. Kathryn ultimately succeeded in petitioning the Tour de France for women's inclusion, securing La Course by Tour de France in 2014, which became Tour de France Femmes in 2022. She now serves as CEO for the Homestretch Foundation, a nonprofit she founded to provide free housing to women athletes struggling with the gender pay gap that persists in cycling. Her latest book is titled Stand: A Memoir on Activism, a Manual for Progress, What Really Happens When We Stand on the Front Lines of Change. The book was a finalist for the Indie Book Awards categories of Best Memoir and Best in Social Change in 2021. In 2022, Bertine was named University of Arizona Alumni of the Year for her work in Tour de France gender equity. Her accomplishments are substantial to say the least, impressive both in quality and number. But as you might guess, the path to achieving them was anything but easy. Today, Kathryn shares her experiences with situational depression, the challenges she faced in advocating for change, and the power of using her voice and platform to amplify the voices of others who may not have the same opportunities. She shares how she balances authenticity with influencing change, how she inspires like-minded individuals to work together, and how she responds when she encounters resistance to change. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. It is my pleasure today to welcome to the show Kathryn Bertine. Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Amber, thank you for having me on your fantastic podcast. I've listened to all the episodes. I am honored to be a guest, and I'm also honored to be your friend.
I know. So full disclosure to folks listening, Kathryn and I have known each other for a very long time now. We go way back, and we will get into some of those details in our conversation today. I also sit on the board of directors for her nonprofit, the Homestretch Foundation. So, just so that everybody is clear on some of those relationships. But I'm really excited to get started with you today and talk about, gosh, there are, in doing my research for our interview, I was really struck by how many really interesting chapters and stories and sub stories and narrative arcs there are weaving through your life. And it's no wonder to me that you are an author among the many other hats you wear. But right now, we are recording in May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And we talk a lot about mindset and the landscapes of our inner worlds on this show, which is a conceptual way of thinking about what's in our heads. But we also have very literal brains in our heads. And just a month ago, Kathryn, you celebrated your brainiversary. What is your brainiversary and why do you celebrate it?
Oh, that's such a great question. My brain anniversary is technically April 3rd. This is going back 8 years ago. I was in a bike race, bad crash happened, and I sustained a really massive TBI to the point where I'm very lucky to be here today. It was a situation of a twice broken skull, and the medic in the caravan was able to control the seizures and basically revive me in the middle of the road. And I am forever thankful that I am here at all, let
Yeah.
alone the fact that my brain has healed enough to the point that the doctors have given me the okay to say that I'm 99% just as weird as I ever was. So that's a huge victory, right? So to think that I'm alive at all and yet just as weird as always is a great sign. So every year I celebrate that, and hence the brain anniversary. And yeah, there's still little things that might pop up. People ask if I still have symptoms, but they're very minor and manageable. Very crowded rooms are tough for the brain to negotiate sound. And sometimes I will make up a word and not realize it until someone's like, "What'd you just say?" Let's see if that happens on the podcast. That could be very entertaining. But other than those, I'm again just lucky to be here, and it gives me this point every year, right? I can celebrate sticking around. that's one.
Yeah.
That's one
Yeah.
end of the mental health. There are other things we'll dive into. I'm sure that I celebrate as well for being around.
Big time. And there was a point where you weren't sure you wanted to stick around.
Correct, correct. So I almost feel like I have two brain anniversaries each year, the physical and then the mental. And you're right. There was a time in my life. We're now going back exactly 10 years. So the summer of 2014. And I was suffering terribly from situational depression, which we'll go into more. And I didn't want to be here anymore. And I'll tell you the whole
Mm.
backstory of that. And I had a plan, I had an exit plan. I was not, it wasn't even that I was sad about life. It was that I no longer felt anything. And that's a huge indication of depression being at its lowest, worst point is when you're numb to everything. And I was in that
Mhm.
zone. I was in that place and I didn't want to be here. I had an exit plan and it was just mere distraction that day that caught me off guard in a good way, saying, wait a minute, okay, something's really wrong. I need help. And I'm now in a very healthy place where I'm able to look back at that time and be like, okay, if I was able to get through that bout of depression and ask for help, if we can help get the message out that if I can do that, anybody can do that, even if they don't feel that they're able. I'd love to talk more about that point too. I think we are slowly chipping away at that stigma of mental health and
Yeah.
mental, yeah, mental health, just as a big, beautiful term that we're now finally being able to uh, look at one another and say, as you know, the phrase, it's okay to not be okay. And I think
Yeah.
that's right. That's such a huge advance because, Amber, I know that you and I grew up in a time where depression was either the clinical one that you're born with, you're
Mhm.
born with a chemical imbalance and you have a clinical depression, or you are, manic depressive or bipolar. And those are like the only two
Mhm.
depressions that I think we were taught or aware of when we were growing up, especially as the
Yeah.
advent of like TV commercials with, Abilify and things and that image of like a little dark rain cloud following us around
Mhm.
all the time. That was the only depression that was
Oh,
out
I
there.
remember those commercials.
Oh, me too. It's like
Yeah.
cemented in there, and
Yeah.
the good part about that was, okay, at least people are starting to talk about depression. But the bad part of that was that if you didn't fall under that spectrum of like, well, I don't have a rain cloud following me around every single day, therefore I
Mhm.
don't have depression, was also something that,
Yeah.
I kind of felt. So when I got to that point of being so depressed that I didn't want to be here anymore, part of it was because I couldn't figure out that there were many branches on the tree of depression. I didn't know that. And so I
Mm.
love being able to talk
Yeah.
to people about situational depression, which happens to so many of us in our lives, whether we have a term for it or not. For me, mine was brought on by a divorce that I didn't see coming. And it was so heavy and so difficult that I didn't realize that things like divorce or death of a loved one or going through even a job change that you might not see coming, or losing a job,
Mhm.
losing a home, anything that's on the spectrum of adulthood, things that are difficult, those things can trigger situational depression. But I didn't know it had that name until I finally got around to doing some research on it. Like, oh,
Yeah.
and situational depression is caused by a situation that's incredibly difficult to endure, but it also has the ability to pass, and that it won't
Mhm.
stay with us for the rest of our lives. But if we don't know that, then situational depression is no different than the deepest, darkest stages of regular depression. And it can
Right.
be just as deadly, just as impactful. So finally being able to give a name to it and then see if anyone else out there might be like, oh, I can resonate with that. I went through a really hard time. I was really down at the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. Then the more we can talk about
Yeah.
that. So how many times have I said situational depression now? It's almost like like, I hope no one's using this as a drinking game because they would be far gone. But I keep hammering home that term just so we remember it.
But it's important, right?
Yeah.
Because, if I remember correctly, your divorce happened, well, initiated
Mm,
in 2014, and the clinical term, even for situational depression, didn't exist at that time until a few years later.
correct. Exactly. So I was in that proverbial no man's land of something's
Mhm.
really wrong, but I don't know what to call it. What we don't know what to
Right.
call it yet. Um, so
Mhm.
I love that it is out there and it's known, but it's not yet well known enough that people can identify that that's what they might be going through.
Yeah.
But yeah, and one of the worst parts about that too. Sorry, go on.
No, no, go ahead, please.
Well, one of the toughest parts about that particular year for me, 2014, was that I had a lot of amazing things going on. That was the year that we gained La Course by Tour de France, where women were finally
Mhm.
able and included in the Tour de France. Finally, something we pushed so long and so hard for. Half the Road, our film on women's pro cycling, was out.
Yes.
It was released in theaters. It was going around the world and it was making a big stir. So we were so excited about that. I had a book that was coming out later that year. So I had all of these amazing things happen that we'd worked so hard for so long. And it's all
Yeah.
falling into place. And this is when you think that your closest friends and family, and if married, your spouse, they're all going to be behind you and celebrating this incredible kind of victorious year. But then
Yeah.
the opposite happened. And that's when my then husband decided he was going to, check out of this marriage. And it not just brought everything crashing down for me, but it divided my life into wearing a mask. So, for the public, I was in the media, at least the cycling side of media, quite a lot that year. And I had to
Yeah.
be this strong, confident woman who sounded like she had her shit together. And,
Mhm.
and then on the other side of that is the fact that I totally didn't. I was unraveling behind the scenes and wearing a mask for at all is not healthy. But when you have to wear a mask for that long, it really took a toll. And that's what brought on, the depression to bring me down, was pretending that I was fine and everything was okay. And the opposite was true.
Yeah. And I feel like that is almost a skill that we cultivate as athletes. Because at some point, when you're called to perform, whether it's in a race or in an interview, you kind of have to set down anything that's distracting to focus on the task at hand. And whether we're intentionally cultivating that skill or not is something that we do over and over and get rewarded for. And then
I
you
agree.
have this major, yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree. Keep going.
This might happen a lot, folks. There is a little bit of latency on the whenever we're interviewing and talking across the internet, so bear with us with that. But when we do that as athletes, it definitely is something that we get rewarded for. And it's almost, I've definitely experienced this in my life where I get this idea that whatever is in front of me, it's just another challenge during which I need to rise to the occasion and, get things done, get through it, and move on to the next challenge. But not all challenges are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we believe that we can compartmentalize and set these things down, it's kind of a myth because they're there with us, whether we want to acknowledge them or not.
Agreed. And when you add to that physical component, whereas elite athletes, or, we're trained to tolerate physical pain, right? Like, oh, it
Yes.
doesn't hurt. It's not that bad. I'm fine.
Mhm.
Your limbs might be
I'm
falling
fine.
off. You might have like road rash up and down your body, but you're fine. You're fine. And
Merely a flesh wound.
just a scratch, just put a scratch. And there's something, I mean, that's a wonderful mentality to have when you're out there on race day doing your thing. It can help you get to the finish line. And I
Mhm.
love that. But it's also a switch that we need to be able to turn off when we're talking about things that are A, not race day oriented, or B, the mental health
Yeah.
side of it too. Like, no, it's really not okay if you're coming apart at the seams, but you're like, no, no, the thread will hold. No, it's okay to sit down and restitch and rethread when necessary. But
Mhm.
we're still figuring out in our culture how to do that, and how to be like, it's okay. We just like now, one of the things that I love is that I think in our modern athletic culture, especially with endurance sports, finally now in our culture, it's so acceptable to have rest days. And
Mhm.
in
Yes.
training blocks, right, rest is now finally heralded as such an important part of the training equation. Because honestly, if you don't have a rest day, you don't recover, and then you can't build
Mhm.
your next, performance. So I think we need those mental health rest days as well.
Yeah.
And when we can say, oh gosh, it's too much, my brain is too tired, I need to sit down and, stop thinking and stop worrying for a time, that needs to be built into our daily lives as well. Whether or not we're a professional athlete, but just saying, well, I'm going to take a mental health day today and do
Yeah.
absolutely nothing, or, knit 10 sweaters if that's what does it for you, whatever it is that makes you feel relaxed and happy, and like you're in a peaceful place. That I think we're slowly getting to realize that that's such an important thing to add into our calendars.
Yeah, I think, you know, as athletes, we focus so much on the physical. And certainly there have been times in my career where I thought I was nailing my training plan because I was nailing the training and I was nailing my rest days. But I was only accounting for the physical training stress when we were building out that training plan and building in those rest days. And I wasn't accounting for the mental and emotional stress of everything else that was going on in my life. And I didn't think I had to because I thought I was and could compartmentalize all of that. But it did affect me. And I think what you're saying is such an important point that not only do we need to account for mental and emotional stress in addition to training stress and build in that mental and emotional rest and recovery the way that we build in physical recovery to a training plan. But another way of looking at this is in terms of injury. I think when we get injured as an athlete, it's easy to think about, just harden up and push through.
Mm.
But you can't exactly harden up and push through a broken bone or a TBI. But when you are experiencing an injury, and I'll call, depression, situational depression, there are moments in life where we experience what I'll just refer to as like mental and emotional injury,
Mhm.
where there's and it can be quite literally physical as well in terms of the chemistry of the brain, but it's not visible and it's not as concrete as a broken bone. For broken bone, there's a really clear, here's an x-ray showing exactly what's wrong. We know very likely what caused it. Here's the protocol for healing, 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks in a cast, or, it's so clear cut and concrete. And you can get x-rays and you can see how it's healing. But with injuries that are not visible, and I'll just, I know this isn't a perfect analogy, so forgive that. But with something like situational depression, it is debilitating, and it is something that absolutely needs to be addressed and treated in the same way that you would a broken bone. Obviously with different modalities and different approaches, but it's not visible to others, so you don't get that sympathy that you would if you were walking down the street with a cast on. And it's so much less concrete and clear in terms of the road to recovery.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And I love you use the term compartmentalize, right? Earlier too, and saying that
Mm-hmm.
that is a term that has very healthy boundaries for certain situations. Like, okay, if we
Right.
are focused on achieving goal A, but things from, B, C, and D in life are popping in, it's good to compartmentalize for a little bit, for a little journey. But we have to remember that life is very fluid and all of our personal, professional, everything, they do blend together at times. And that's normal. And if we can compartmentalize things in the short term because we're focused on achieving one goal, that's okay. But if we try to keep compartmentalizing our sanity,
Mm-hmm.
be like, oh yeah, I'm always okay, I'm always fine, and I'll be depressed when it suits my schedule. Then
Yeah. This
that's
depression does not work with my schedule right
right,
now.
right. I'm gonna put it on a shelf. I'll get back to it later, but that's not how it works, right? And I think it's so important to know that when we feel that when we're trying to compartmentalize things, but it's not working, to
Mm-hmm.
to let it to take it off the shelf and let it do its thing, let it breathe. I use the analogy in Stand in the book, saying that we've all got our demons. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe instead of this phrase of trying to kill our demons, whether it's depression, whether it's anything, instead of trying to kill our demons, let's build a stable and house our demons
Ooh.
in this stable. And when they come knocking, let them run free for a little bit and then put them back in the stable and
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge, like, okay, depression, okay, anxiety, okay, whatever it is that gets you, say, I recognize you're there. I'm going to let you run around the yard for a little bit. And I'm going to put you back. And
Mm-hmm.
that becomes a lot more, I think, for me anyway, like I'm not a psychologist, and this little stable that I have in my mind, I recognize if that doesn't work for anyone, that's fine. It works for me, to acknowledge
Yeah.
our issues and to let them be rather than try to kill them. It takes a little bit of pressure off ourselves of feeling like we need to have the answers and that we're not okay if it's not gone. We are okay
Mm-hmm.
if we
Yeah.
put them over in the stable.
Yeah. It's funny. I had a conversation with one of my swim coaches from my early days in age group swimming. And I was very fortunate that my coaches at the time were clinical psychologists. So they were really up on this stuff.
Yes.
And I had this conversation with my coach, the clinical psychologist, in my late 30s. So he had known me obviously for a very long time, since before I was 10. And we went through some stuff, right? Like, so he had really seen me through some very high highs, very low lows. And in my late 30s, when we were having this conversation, I was talking about my struggles at the time with anxiety. And I still struggle with anxiety. I'm not going to pretend that's in the past. But you made this really great point, which was that there's the anxiety, and fill in the blank here, right? Depression, whatever it happens to be. There's the anxiety. And then there's other layers on top of that. There's shame about the anxiety. There's judgment about the anxiety. There's fighting against the anxiety. And all of those things take so much cognitive and emotional energy. And if you just step back and say, okay, I've got anxiety, and I will probably always have anxiety. And in the context of this conversation with my coach, he was kind of like, yeah, this was there when you were 10, when you were 20, when you were 30. Like, this might not be something that's going away, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And actually just stepping back and saying, okay, accepting it and removing those layers of fighting, judging, feeling shame, already that is such a huge relief, such a huge burden lifted, that the anxiety itself actually kind of feels easy to carry and deal with as in comparison.
Absolutely. I love how you phrased it. That's so true. It's part of us, and maybe it resurfaces, maybe it doesn't. Either way, just to acknowledge, like, okay, this is part of my journey, and to remind ourselves too that everybody is going to go through something really tough in this life if they haven't
Yeah.
already. And if
Yeah.
it's, unless they're a unicorn, and I don't know many unicorns that are out there, but it's really hard to get to your, I'm in my late 40s, so it's hard to get to your late 40s and not have gone through a difficult and, dare I say, traumatic experience at some point
Mm-hmm.
in your life.
Yeah.
And, uh, and to know that, like, when we look around at friends and at strangers, everyone's probably been through something really difficult, and to have those conversations, knowing that, we don't have to always ask, like, oh, what have you been through? What's your trauma? But to at least know that if you did bring up that question, probably just about everybody at the table who's, 40 plus, even 30 plus, will
Mm-hmm.
probably have something
Yeah.
to add to that, and to remind us that, we're not alone on this journey. Our journey might be very
Yes.
specific and might have,
Mm-hmm.
very detailed answers to what it is we go through, what we experience. But on the whole, like, you know, we're all going through something, or we'll go through something. And that, I feel that that's very bonding, you know, uh,
Yes.
every now and
Yeah.
then you might encounter that personality who, who wants to play the game of, like, well, my trauma is bigger than your trauma. you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I find the best tactic with that is to, like, kind of nod politely and listen. But
Mm-hmm.
to know that usually those who play that card are probably not fully healed from their trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
those who are a lot more open and understanding, and can be like, oh, I hear you. I've been through something along those lines. Uh, but if you have the one upper mentality, yeah, just nod your
That's a whole
head and
different ballgame.
listen. But, especially as an athlete, you want to be like, no, my trauma's worse than yours, but
The inner competitor.
I'm going to win this trauma game. So I would suggest not engaging in that, but just, lending an ear, and then letting that one go, and knowing that they've got a little bit more work
Yeah.
to do. And
Yeah.
that can be helpful too.
Well, I want to revisit this idea of like misconceptions around depression, a few of them. And you pointed one out, which is situational depression itself. For anyone playing that game at home, we're saying it again. But the idea that depression can be transient and specifically connected to, a particular event in life or experience. And it's not just something that you're born with. It's not just, a permanent chemical imbalance. But you mentioned something else, which I thought was important, was that preconceived notion of what depression would feel like. And I'm right there with you, seeing those pharmaceutical ads back in the day. in believing that depression was really about just feeling sad all the time,
Mhm.
just sad. And I too have struggled with depression. And in your book, one thing that really struck me was you called it out as the empties. And I thought that was such a good way of putting it, because it wasn't feeling sad or down in the dumps or anything like that. It was a completely devastating and consuming sense of like apathy and emptiness and nothing. It couldn't even feel anything. Like it would have actually felt good to feel sad at that point, because it would have been a relief to just feel something.
Mhm.
Was that your experience? And
Yeah.
how did you miss that it was depression because you were expecting a different experience?
Yes, exactly that. I was expecting, the sad rain cloud and
Mhm.
to feel sad, that I would always feel sad and down. And when I started feeling nothing at all, which, yes, you mentioned, I refer to that as the empties with a capital E, you know, um,
Yeah.
because there was nothing there. And for me, for context, I've always been a great feeler of things. I'm in the creative arts area of life. So I have a lot of emotion, a lot of capacity to feel, all the emotions that are out there. And that's something that I've always used to draw good energy and creativity from. So when I got hit by the empties and I felt absolutely nothing, good, bad, sad,
Mhm.
anything, I think that's when I knew that I was at my very, very lowest and it couldn't get any worse because I just didn't
Yeah.
have the capacity to care about anything. And um, that's that's I think the most dangerous point, because if you feel like
Yeah.
you have nothing to care about, even if you can acknowledge that yes, you have friends who love you, yes, you have family who loves you, even with that, knowing that you're loved and there are people who care. And in inside, you also know that you care about these people, but the empties are so
Yeah.
powerful that that doesn't matter. You start thinking like,
Mhm.
yeah, but they'd be better off without me. Or you have these really horrible
Right.
thoughts, right? So you know you're loved,
Yeah.
but it doesn't matter. That's when, if you ever get to that point, the most effective thing you can do is to ask for help. Even
Yes.
just saying those words out loud to a person that is safe or trusted. For
Mhm.
me, that was my dad. I was able to say, "Dad, I think I need some
Yeah.
help." And if you don't feel that you have a person who is that safe or trusted space, then a couple options are: one, you could research. On Psychology Today, you can actually plug in your zip code and look for a therapist that fits your zip code.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, like a online dating profile of psychologists. You can actually read about them. So I would encourage anyone to try that. If they don't feel they have
Mhm.
someone safe, they could say they need help too. And then, of course, we have the number to call now too. I hope I don't get this wrong, but I believe it's 988, and that's the helpline. Just feel that can be your phone call and be like, I think I need help, and it can be enough of a distraction
Yeah.
to get you to take that next step. But those were definitely the
Yeah.
most empowering words for me to know, like, okay, uh, I got nothing left. So this is my one. And then we can talk about the distraction part too, which
Yeah, so what was it that brought you to that point of being able to say those words out loud that you need help?
yeah, it was a rather incredible experience that the timing of this aligned. But I was at my lowest point. The date that I was planning to end it all and to check out was August 11th of 2014. And
Mhm.
I'll spare you the long journey of going through this plan, but I had a letter written. Instead of leaving it, I was going to mail it, right? And before I went into town and mailed this letter, I did one last check on on social media. I even put a positive oriented post, something about whether it was the Tour de France or something positive that, would kind of throw off the track of where I was headed.
Hmm.
But I opened up social media and news. I turned on the internet basically, and I saw that Robin Williams had taken his life. That's when the news got out about Robin Williams. And it was A, a huge distraction. All of a sudden, instead of,
Hmm.
closing the internet and my laptop and going on with my plan, I was very much in WTF mode. I'm like, what happened? How could this most beloved person in our circles of comic energy, of feeling good, somebody who made us laugh, how could this person be so down and devastated that we didn't know about this and he took his life? And so I wanted to solve this. Like, what happened? What happened? And it was enough to throw me off in the very best way, being like, wait a minute, if Robin Williams was suffering, then maybe I'm not so alone in this suffering. And if
Wow.
if
Yeah.
he's causing this amount of devastation to all of us who loved and adored him, maybe I need to stop and think for a minute. And that's
Yeah.
when I went to my dad and was like, I don't know if you heard this news. Did you hear this news? And then I was like, Dad, I think I need help. And saying those words out loud,
Mm.
that's what changed it. And I forever mark, the anniversary of his passing as something that actually saved my life.
Wow.
It was profound in so many ways. I mean, Amber, you and I, we grew up with Robin Williams comedy on so many levels, from movies
Oh,
to
yeah.
shows to Mork and Mindy, everything. Like, he was so ingrained in my life. So,
And he was such a cycling advocate. So
oh
even in
yeah,
our, there was like the film and the movie part of him,
yeah,
but then there was also this beloved human who loved bicycles. And I think you and I both met him on occasions
yeah.
because of, our just crossing paths in the cycling community.
Yes, and to take it even one step more personal too, we had been making Half the Road, a film on women's cycling,
Hmm.
and I reached out to his agent to see if we could hire him to do narration for the film. And
Yeah.
he was working on another project, if not like 5 million projects, right? But he was already
Yeah.
fully engrossed in his next project. But what I love is that he responded. He didn't just
Mm.
have his agent say like, "No, I'm busy." He expressed his best wishes and saying like, "I wish I could be part of this. I'm currently just booked solid, but I wish you all the best on this film."
Oh,
And that, of course, when it's one of your heroes in life, when you get a response like that, he was
of
excited to watch
course.
it in the future. Like, that was just like, it was amazing. So I felt that I had
Everything.
that, connection. And yeah, and of course I reached out to him, not just because he's awesome, but because of his cycling connection and
Yeah.
how much he loved the sport, how much he loved bikes. So yeah, that delivered and hit home so many ways.
Yeah. Just a few minutes ago, you were talking about the depression. You described it as an inability to care.
Mhm.
And it's so beautiful that your connection with him sparked just in that instant. Suddenly there was something that you cared about, right?
Absolutely.
Hearing that news, like you cared about, even if it was just solving the mystery of why we would do this, which is kind of ironic because you were in the exact same headspace.
Yes, it
But
is.
yeah.
It's ironic. It's weird. Let's call it like it's crazy that all transpired on that day. Uh,
Yeah.
but it's good to kind of have a chuckle about it too and be like, oh my God, that's pretty intense on a lot of levels. But they also
Yeah.
say too, they being the experts in mental health, that one of the biggest things that acts as a defense mechanism against suicide is, very simply put, distraction. If we can
Uh-huh.
distract somebody from that moment, it's all that it takes. It's enough to stop it from happening that day.
Mhm.
And that was huge. So that was a monumental thing, and to know that distraction is important. And if we ever have the ability to distract somebody who's that low and that down and struggling with the empties, that can be a pretty powerful moment.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just about, okay, distract through this day and then the
Mhm.
next day and then the next day. And sometimes it really is just about getting through one day at a time. But before you know it, you've put together weeks and months and years. And, like you said, if it is a situational depression, there's a light at the other side of that.
There's absolutely like there has been so much joy and amazingness that has come through this past decade. I mean, we're coming up on the 10-year mark
I
of
know.
this, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I've been so fortunate to have so much goodness come my way in this past decade. But I'll also say struggle too.
Hmm.
It's very important that we make sure people know that if they get through their situational depression, it doesn't mean that life isn't going to throw you more hurdles and more challenges that come up, but
No.
it does mean that if you can get through that bout of depression and understand where it came from, what it's about, it'll be that much more helpful when you go through the other life challenges that come our way. You know
Yeah.
this. I mean, I lost my dad during the pandemic, and I was like, oh my God, like,
Yes.
am I strong enough to handle this challenge of grief? And during that, before that, we made Homestretch Foundation. That was one of the greatest joys of my life. There were relationships, ups and downs. So a lot of stuff happens. So it's not like we're totally immune once
Mm-mm.
we go through and heal from one depression. But I do think we're definitely better equipped to make the next round of
Yeah.
choices.
I think that there's something to be said for, moving in from that space of not being able to care, not being able to feel, being able to care and feel on any level, even if it isn't, you know, the real positive, joyful emotions. It can be a relief just to feel sad, even just to have a feeling. And having been through that experience, I don't know if this is the case for you. It is for me at this point. I feel familiar now with those red flags of like, oh, I've been down this path before. I know where this leads. And every time that happens and I ask for help sooner and sooner, it becomes easier and easier to see the signs and get help to avoid going all the way down that path, which, we know where it leads, and it's not a great place. And getting past, the situational depression, you make a really good point. It's not going to be rainbows and puffy clouds, and that's
Mhm.
not the point. The point is to feel engaged in life,
Yeah.
whatever it may bring.
I could not agree more. It's so important to be like, yay, feelings. It's not like when we're having a really a sad day and we're like moping around. I definitely, in the moment, you're not like, oh, I'm so glad I feel sad.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It doesn't quite work that way, but it definitely, when you are in a healthier mental headspace, you are able to
Mhm.
be like, oh, you know what? I had a really crap day yesterday or a really crap week, but yeah, okay, I got through it. And therefore,
Mhm.
yes, I recognize that having very normal life feelings and ups and downs and happies and sads, that's so much better than feeling nothing at
Yeah.
all, for sure.
And even just to feel grounded in the transience of those emotions, right? Like whatever it is that I'm feeling, I know it's going to pass. Like this, this negative feeling, whatever it is not going to last forever. There will be something that comes after this, and I know that I can surf that wave, whatever it is it's kind of a superpower.
It is. And I love that you bring up surfing the wave because waves of, I'm going to use the term grief, but waves of grief,
Yeah.
depression, sadness, that's exactly what they are. They're waves. And if we can be like, oh,
Hmm.
here comes a wave, I'm in the wave, but I brought my surfboard. I'm on the wave. It's freeing to know that this wave will come, it'll hit, and it'll roll through. And when we can
Hmm.
acknowledge the wave factor, we are already ahead of the game. Yeah.
Yeah. So true.
Mm.
Yeah, and to not fight the wave, like you said, like grab the surfboard, and you're not, under that wave struggling against it. Because I mean, let's be honest, like that's not a fight you're going to win.
Yeah.
But to roll with it,
Yeah.
it doesn't make the grief less. It doesn't make the sadness less. It doesn't. But it's a little bit easier
Mhm.
than fighting it. It's a little bit easier,
Absolutely.
and sometimes that makes all the difference.
It's so true. It's so true. And yeah, I mean, if you've ever been rolled by a wave, like swimming in the ocean or playing around, you're like, oh
Yeah.
man, that's not fun. I would rather not be in this wave. But that's also nature. That's what happens, and that's what it does. To recognize that for sure is a huge, huge thing.
Yeah.
And to sometimes give acknowledgement to what type of wave that you're in. Are you in a depression because of something that has happened in any spectrum? Whether it's, again, family stuff, home life, work life, acknowledge the type of wave that's got you down and it's rolling you right now,
Hmm.
and to remind yourself like that's normal. If you're in the grief wave because somebody that you love has passed, to acknowledge that that too is very, very normal to, to
Hmm.
have these waves kind of hit you and to adjust to that new spectrum of like what is life going to be like now that this person might not be around. These are all so normal um areas of grief, of depression, of the waves that hit us through life. And just to keep reminding yourself, like, okay, this is normal. It's normal not to,
Yeah.
it's normal. Here comes the wave. Take cover
Yeah.
or surfboard, however you want to approach it, for sure. Yep.
Yeah. We've been friends for a long time, so there are countless things that I appreciate about you. So, and I couldn't even begin to name them all in one podcast episode. But one of the things that I really appreciate is how open and vulnerable you've been, not only about your mental health and TBI, your whole story. I mean, Kathryn has literally written books about her life and her life experiences. The most recent one being Stand. And Stand was kind of a next level vulnerability and openness and honesty about your experience. And the title of the book is Stand: What Really Happens When We Stand on the Front Lines of Change. And it is, if you want to hear more about the stories that we're talking about right now, absolutely go grab that book. There's so much more in that book too. And it goes back to kind of what happens to the whole human being who is standing up in front of those microphones, standing up to the powers that be to affect change through advocacy. And we talk to a lot of leaders. We look up to people who are very inspirational figures, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they too are human beings with struggles and lives that we may never see. And Kathryn does a beautiful job of weaving together all of these narrative arcs in this book and giving us like just a really beautiful glimpse at what that was like for her. So, and I'm speaking about you in the third person now, but
I'm still here.
speaking to the audience here. Yeah, still here. But I want to talk a little bit about that advocacy. And one of the things that came up in the book, which I thought was just a really, and I know like you mentioned it at one point in the book, but it's definitely something that I know that you've dealt with a few times, which is there were times where, for lack of a better word, you get reprimanded for making key stakeholders uncomfortable or for publicly voicing your opinion in a way that's going to make people uncomfortable, when that discomfort might jeopardize the change that you were hoping to affect. And that creates a really tricky balance to strike, right? Like, how do you embrace your authenticity and your voice at the same time as continue to influence for the change that you want to see happen when using your voice is making the powers that be really uncomfortable? I want to ask, do you approach this tension differently now than when you did 10 years ago?
Oh, that's such a great question, Amber. I think that if we dare to step onto that the front lines of change, right?
Yes.
If we want to fight for something to change, that when we look around society and say, hey, that doesn't seem right, that doesn't seem up to par, it's not equal, like I want to make change. I think the biggest thing to know is that if we do step onto that front lines for something that we love and care so deeply about, it will blur the line of our public and our personal lives.
Mm,
I think when I first started this journey about wanting to get women back into the Tour de France, and I'll come back to that, why we say back into the Tour de
yeah.
France. But the short story being like there was a women's tour in the 80s, even in the 50s, and then women were banned from the Tour de France.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted them to return to the race, which seemed it seemed like a given.
Obvious?
Yeah, obvious in this day and
Yeah.
age. Why are we not investing in the women's side of the sport?
Yeah.
Um, so in my head, part of that is that it seems so clear cut, and that everybody would be on board with this. Like, why not? Rising
Yeah.
tide lifts all boats. When we add women, we will not just amplify the women's side of the sport, but we'll also lift the men's side of the sport. Surely
Right.
everybody will understand this. So what was mind blowing to me was how much pushback we got, how many people didn't understand. And it really boiled down to the fact that, to put it in a very quick one sentence nutshell, change scares the crap out of people. And the
Yes.
fact that, we were simply trying to create benevolent change didn't register as much as like, oh, change, scary, to the powers that
Mhm.
be. So I very much started uh, this journey, this fight, thinking that it would be a common sense thing and it would happen very quickly and all parties would agree. And I had no idea how much of my personal life would be affected by standing up and changing the world. So much so that it became a 400-page book. you know, There's so many instances along the way. But to kind of circle back to your question of um, now the way that I look at the world, if I see some areas of inequity that still need to be solved, I have a much bigger understanding that it's going to take time, that it's going to
Mhm.
ruffle the feathers of
Yes.
tradition. And of course, for me, the number one rule that I know already from learning this experience firsthand is that change happens when we band together with like minded individuals. So we don't have to bear the brunt of this journey alone. That's when the magic
Yeah.
happens. That's when everything truly comes together. So I know if I'm going to saddle up on the the horse of equality again, that I'm going to make sure I have a stable full of horses and people. You know, this is different than the demon stable. Just to let you know, I've got a few different stables going on up there. Sometimes I get confused which stable I'm in, but
That's the TBI talk.
yeah, that's the T, right, exactly. You should see all the stables. Um, but it's definitely something I've learned, unfortunately the hard way, but also very thankfully the hard
Mhm.
way that, there are many facets to creating change, and I now feel like I have a better plan in play. But I also write about this. The end of Stand is really, an index of if anyone else wants to try to create change in their neck of the woods, what they believe in. There's a bit of a glossary there to highlight, do these things, don't do these things. And what I'm
Mm.
hopeful, and part of really why I wanted to write Stand was less about my journey, but more about how my journey could potentially help others who want to bridge
Yeah.
that equality gap or that change making gap. And I love that I've seen
Yeah.
some evidence of people who are using that that story and the appendix at the end of the book to to help them with their journey as well. That gives me a lot of happy feels.
Well, it's so cool because when you read the book, you get to follow your journey of encountering these challenges, problem solving, figuring things out, so that by the time you get to that part of the book, which is sort of like an activism playbook, like, here's the playbook if you want to get started, you have all of this beautiful context of, okay, how did you arrive at these lessons learned? And it creates so much depth and context to it. It's if you haven't read this book, anybody listening, I highly, highly recommend it. Not just because Kathryn is my friend, but it is objectively an excellent book. It's funny, it's sad, it's uplifting. It's just super honest and beautiful. But I think that, yeah, I love that you want to use your experience and your stories to help empower others. And I think there have been times in your journey, and you write about this in the book as well, how that people really misunderstand your motivations and assume that you're out to, make a name for yourself or, put yourself in the spotlight. And I've personally known you long enough to know that that is absolutely not the case, and that if you didn't have to be the person out there in the spotlight and you could achieve the same thing, you absolutely would. And I want to point out one thing that I noticed as an athlete when you were doing this work was you were often in a position to be able to speak publicly on things that other athletes couldn't.
Mm.
So one of the things was when Kathryn was racing, and I mentioned this in the introduction, she was representing St. Kitts and Nevis. And a lot of the women that she was racing with were representing the United States. And so as an athlete representing the United States, I was beholden to the USA Cycling Federation. And oftentimes in my team contracts, even if it wasn't, a USA Cycling contract, even if it was a professional team contract, there would be language in that contract curtailing my ability to speak my mind publicly on social media if I had a negative opinion about a sponsor or some staff on the team. So as professional athletes, we're hustling really hard and we are scraping by to get that next contract. So we don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize that next contract because this is our big dream. We want to, make the Olympic team. We want to go to the world championships. We want to do these big things and we have to get that next contract in order to make those dreams come true. So in many ways, we aren't able to say the things that we would like to say and advocate in the ways we'd like to, but you were in this really unique position to be able to give voice to what a lot of women wanted to say and felt like they couldn't.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, it took both aspects. So I was in this very, very
Mm-hmm.
unique position where, and I'll give you the short story because the long one is in the other book, but you know,
Yeah.
short story is I'm a dual citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis. And so I chose to race for St. Kitts and Nevis during my entire amateur and professional cycling career. And just
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, because I had that leverage then to be able to speak a little bit more freely than athletes who are under their bigger and quote unquote more powerful national banner, I was like, oh, I can
Mm-hmm.
use this. I also was at that time a journalist for ESPN. So I had access to giving more visibility to cycling. And,
Right.
and so I'd write about all of the other athletes in the sport. And that's when I knew I had some leverage. I was like, ooh, we could make a film. We could make a film about
Mm-hmm.
the highs and the lows, the passion, the pitfalls, and the power of women's pro cycling. So I pitched this documentary idea to ESPN, and my boss there, a female boss, shot it down, saying, "Oh, well, does anyone watch women's cycling?" To which I responded, "No, because there's no way for them to see it. We don't have any film. But you're ESPN. We can change that so that, yes, people can watch women's cycling." And she still was like, No, I don't think so. And that's what flipped that switch for me of being like, okay, you know what? I can make this film myself, which is this very scary
Yeah.
thing to say out loud when you've never made a film and you have no idea if you actually can do this. But I at least knew enough. I'm like, okay, if we hire the right team, cinematographers, videographers, editors, I do know at least I can write, I can string together a sentence or two enough to have it at least be coherent. And also I have access to all the amazing women like yourself, Amber,
Mhm.
all the incredible women who are
Oh.
racing at the top of their, don't you get bashful on me. You're amazing. And you also play such a pivotal role. And I need your listeners to know this.
Mm.
You were so kind and welcoming to me. And here I am, this athlete who's trying to get to the pro ranks, who's racing for St. Kitts and Nevis. I was on the older end of the spectrum of this time where, you
Mhm.
know, people were not getting contracts in their 30s and 40s. But I'm, trying to do all this. And you were so kind and gracious and just a benevolent soul right from the beginning. And had you been like, oh, no, don't bother, this is a waste of time, or if you had been mean or nasty, that could have changed so much for me. And you and I both know there
Mm.
are women in the sport who do unfortunately have that mentality. Very few, but there are a few who, like,
Yeah.
if you meet somebody who's mean and nasty, then that could have affected my decision to kind of keep going forward. But I was like, no, I
Yeah.
want to be able to highlight women like Amber, women like Lauren
Oh,
Hall,
thank you.
Dotsie Bausch, like
Yeah.
are people in the sport who are just, incredible humans on and off the bike. So, because when I came to you and our other compatriots in women's pro cycling saying, hey, I have the ability to make a film, will you be part of it? The fact that you all said yes is why this film happened. If you all had been like, no,
Mm.
weirdo, I don't know what you're talking about, that then we wouldn't have had any traction. So it's very much a mutual benefit that you all were kind enough to entertain this weirdo over here and say, I'll be part of this film. And that's where all the magic truly, truly happened. And I think one of the biggest things that came from that, or the biggest thing that came from that film, is that when I had access to all of these women, and I would ask the question, do you want to race the Tour de France? Do you want to be part of, and every single woman said yes. Every now and then we get a track cyclist who was like, no, I don't want to race the Tour de France. That's too long. But they also understood. They're like, but we want you to race it. Like, so so they were on our side in the best way.
Yeah.
And that's when I knew we had the real traction to move forward. Because now I'm like, okay, I might not be a national or world champion. I might not be an Olympian, but I know those who are. And if they're willing to band together, then we can make change happen in the Tour de France. So that's where everything truly came together and it changed. And we formed the Tour Entier, the pressure group to make the Tour de France happen for women again. And we won that. And that was an amazing part of the journey. But the real nugget here of creating change is that I first tried doing this by myself, reaching out to ASO saying, hey, we need a women's tour. And I've heard crickets.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was like, okay, let's make a film, let's make a mission, let's make something that people can see and connect to. That's when I knew we had real power. And that's what flipped it in our favor. But interesting to go back to, the side of there being forces behind the scenes that don't want you to succeed. I experienced that. A director on my team was like, you need to stop talking about this equality stuff. And she fully thought that I was making a film about myself, like that I was doing all this selfie style. And I kept saying, no, that's not it. You'll see me pop up a couple of times, but this film is not about me. It's so hard to get someone on your side when they can't see the end product of the vision that's in your head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I met a lot of strife that way from a couple of key players, but I'm so thankful that the majority of the women and men trusted the vision. And things changed when we had enough footage to actually put out a trailer and you're in the trailer, you got it. You totally, I love that. All of you fabulous listeners of Be a Good Wheel, you got to go check out both the trailer and the film so that you can see Amber lending her beautiful voice and face to this movement and this mission. And it's out there. It's on all the streaming platforms. And this is where I have to be careful. I'm like, I don't want you to watch a movie about me. I want you to watch a movie that, shifted the paradigm for women's cycling. So I'm so thankful you were part of that. Thank you.
Likewise. I thank you for saying thank you. And I mean, to me, it was like the most obvious thing in the world, but I so appreciate what you did for all of us. And I think this goes back to what you said about balance. The way to address that tension is not alone, and gathering people and bringing them to support the cause. And you did that in so many ways, not only because you were in a position to say the things that couldn't be said, right? You were in that position. So I do think that a lot of the time when people confuse your motivation and think, oh, Kathryn was making this film about herself, or she's, self-promoting. It wasn't that you were self-promoting. It was just you stood in the moments when no one else could, because other people had too much more to risk, more to lose than you did. And you were willing to put what you had to lose on the line so that these voices could be heard, if not directly from the people who would want to voice them, but through you. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. And by doing that, by recognizing that there was this critical mass of support for change and assuming that role yourself, which came at a major personal cost, right? I mean, with a lot of good things too, but you stepped into that role so that there could be a clear rallying cry. There could be a central focus. We'll hear more from Kathryn after this quick break. We want to make this podcast financially sustainable and need your help to keep a good thing going. Sign up for a Be a Good Wheel membership on Ko-Fi and get access to extended guest interviews, bonus episodes, and Be a Good Wheel gear. Monthly memberships start as low as $3 per month. Go to ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel to join other members who are supporting the show. That's ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel. And now back to our conversation with author, athlete, activist, founder, and documentary filmmaker, Kathryn Bertine. I know that a lot of this evolved organically and it wasn't like this master plan that you had from day one, but it is such a beautiful example of how you can be one person and gather together just this huge number of people to support something. And I think a lot of us get stuck in thinking I'm only one person, but you're not. You're not just one person. And all it takes is one person to say the thing out loud and realize how many other people will, rally at your side to help.
I'm so glad. Oh my gosh. Thank you. Okay. Now I'm getting all bashful and shy, but no, thank you for bringing up the most important part of Stand and the film and all of the traction that we've gained and made. The fact of the matter is we are all capable of creating change. We do not have to be famous, wealthy, Olympic champions. We can create change from exactly where we are and who we are. And I always, my running joke is I'm like, yeah, if I was able to create change at the Tour de France from an apartment in Tucson, Arizona, then you all can do anything, and it's so true. And my greatest role was the fact that what I do very well is I'm a good organizer. I can organize. And that might sound like people are like, oh, you mean you can like rearrange your closet? Like, no, actually, I can't do that very well. But the organizational power that I have is to gather who's good at what and bring them together. Right. So, when we think about the 4 women who comprise the Tour Entier, the big mission to get women to the Tour de France, it was Marianne Vos, the greatest of all time in women's cycling. Yes. Emma Pooley, Olympic medalist and world champion. Chrissy Wellington over on the triathlon side, also 4-time world champion. And then there's me, right? So I was able to reach out to these amazing women because they also wanted to be part of this change. But they were the superstars and I was the space dust. But, someone's got to drive this bus of progress. And I'm like, okay, I'll drive the bus, but they can be superstars. And I think that's so important, and again, I didn't know any of these women personally. They were not close friends of mine, but I did have the power to reach out and ask questions. And that's part of the organizer's role, So I think anybody who might be feeling like, oh, well, I'm not a millionaire. I don't have a huge social media presence. I'm not famous. What can I do? A lot. You can do a lot because I did, and so can you. And as long as in fact, I think it's very important to have that perspective that, if you're doing it for stardom, I don't suggest activism is your game. But if you're doing it to truly create and affect change that will last in this world, whether or not you're here, like that's the big thing to kind of say, yeah, I want to make change happen because this is something I believe in, then that's the right call to activism. Whether or not your name is attached to it, that part needs to be secondary. And then you know that you're on the right track.
For sure. You bring up a really good point too, that you're joking, right? But serious, that if you can do it, anyone can. And that sounds self-deprecating, but it really isn't. And I know you, so I know that this is just like a very honest thing that you want to get across. And I think it's a really powerful point. And that is that I know, at least for myself, when I started racing, I too had big ideas for, what I wanted women's sport to be and the change that I would like to try to make myself. But in my head, I had this idea that I had to get certain results. Okay, if I could win this race, if I could go to the Olympics, if I could become a world champion, then the world would give me the credibility and influence I would need to make that change. And what I learned the hard way is, number one, it doesn't matter how good you are. That influence and empowerment always comes from within.
Yes.
Like, the world doesn't hand it to you. And the other thing is, you can create that without the results. You can create that anywhere. You don't need the Olympics to have a platform. It doesn't hurt, but you don't need it. And that's one of the things, and I don't mean this to belittle your professional career or results or anything like that, but to say that you can, I mean, I never made it to the Olympics either. So here we are. But you don't need that to build a platform for yourself. You don't need that to affect real, meaningful change in the world. And it's a beautiful message that really comes through in the book and in your story.
Oh, thank you, Amber. And I so appreciate that. And in fact, it was actually not making it to the Olympics that got us this women's Tour de France, because I was able to see, like, wait, if I didn't make it to the games, why was that? And it wasn't just the fact that there were athletes who are stronger and faster than me, but I actually got this close look at the qualification procedure for the Olympics and how
Mm-hmm.
smaller nations don't have the same opportunities, how the women's
Right.
races are fewer and farther between to qualify for the games. Like, there were so many inequities along the way that it opened that door for me. I'm like, okay, if getting to the Olympics is not an equal platform worldwide in cycling, then what else is wrong with this sport? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's where the door was open to me on the fact that we didn't have women at the Tour de France, et cetera. So it's interesting that what could have been seen as a quote unquote failure of not getting to the games actually became a huge success in getting women to the Tour de France. And of course, you never know this at the start, right? You don't know anything. like,
Right. Right.
like going into it, this is all in hindsight. But I think that's so important too, that if we don't make a certain goal that we've set for ourselves, athletically or otherwise, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what did we learn, not just about ourselves, but about the way that the world works during that journey?
Yeah.
And did it potentially turn our attention to something new that,
Mm-hmm.
could give us a really amazing platform for doing whatever the next thing is? And that's kind of what happened during this crazy cycling journey that I had no idea, would turn out or play out this way. And now here I am looking back on what is, hang on, I'm doing math. This will take a second. Um, I've been in the sport of cycling uh, 18 years, roughly, from the amateur side to the professional side to the retirement side and all the activism stuff in between. And I'm finally now like able to look at this and say that the greatest thing that's come from all of this, yes, the change making, that's up there, but the lifelong contacts and friendships that I have made through this sport make everything, all of the struggles worth the journey. Like the fact that I have bonded for life with certain people because of what this sport has given me is the most powerful, amazing thing. So, if
To
someone's
hear.
ever like, yeah, if someo's like, oh, you didn't make it to the games, I'm like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter. Like that's small
Right. Right.
potatoes.
Not that it doesn't matter at all, but the
Right.
things that really stay with you are those relationships. I
Oh,
couldn't agree more. Well,
yeah,
let's dig in a little bit to the behind the scenes of La Tour Entier, because as the organizer, as the person, you well, first of all, the focus on the Tour de France. I just want to highlight that for a moment and why that's so important. The Tour de France in the sport of cycling is the premier marquee event of all cycling events. It is far more well known, lucrative, impactful than the Olympics or the World Championships in the sport of cycling. And the fact that it's been a men's only event for a long time, and it wasn't always a men's only event, meant that women didn't have the opportunity to access that visibility, to showcase their athleticism and what they can do on a bike in the same way that men could. And that lack of opportunity actually had really just massive consequences for funding in the sport. And you get into this cycle of, okay, well, there's not enough funding to get, women cycling on TV. Well, if we're not on TV, then we can't get the exposure. We need to get the funding. And you end up in this vicious cycle. And the Tour de France is a really, really key piece in all of that. So Kathryn so shrewdly identified this as a lever, right? A really powerful lever that she could leverage in building a path toward more equity in the sport for women. How did you decide on the group of four? Like, how did you decide to reach out to to Mariana Voss, Emma Pooley, and Chrissy Wellington. I think Chrissy Wellington is such an interesting pick too, because she's a triathlete.
Yeah.
So as a triathlete, she wouldn't be racing the Tour de France, even if this is successful. So
Right.
tell me a little bit about, as the organizer, what were you thinking when you put this group together?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love this part of the journey. It was really, really fun. So the first part being that when we were making Half the Road, and I was able to interview all these amazing women, of whom those three were part of the film, I asked each, do you want to go to the Tour de France? And it was very obvious to me that Marianne Voss had to be part of this because she was, and still is, but at that time she was definitely the highest ranking cyclist in women's cycling that we had, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Possibly greatest living cyclist of all time.
I personally agree with that. Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And but it was Emma Pooley. After I interviewed her, she and I connected when I reached out to her saying, "Hey, listen, I'm thinking of, kind of starting something to really gain traction for this Tour de France. I don't know if it's a petition. I don't know what we do, but I really want to make something happen." And she had been thinking the same thing. So we were both on that mental side of
Oh,
like, okay. And I said, well, let's also bring in Mariana Voss and reach out to her. And Marianne was in. And then Chrissy, I had overlapped. Not only had I written articles about her for ESPN, but she and I were
mm-hmm.
on a bike tour together. And so, I had direct access to her. And I said, and it was actually Chrissy, we were calling and chatting one day. She's like, so what are you working on? I'm like, well, there's this Tour de France thing I'd like to see happen. And she's like, oh, I want in. I want to be part of that. She's like, I don't want to race it, but I want to be, part of the mission for this. So I was like, okay, now we've
Wow.
got a team of power players. And I also remember thinking at that
Mm-hmm.
particular time, actually, because I had seen other examples of groups that get together that try to effect change, but they're too big and it's too many cooks in the
Mm-hmm.
kitchen. And so,
Oh.
yeah, we've had a few even in women's cycling. Like, let's all band together and
Mm-hmm.
fight for change. But if it's so many people all at once, it can have the exact opposite effect. We lose focus, or
Right.
we don't streamline it properly. So it's like, okay, I think the four of us would be great, but then we can always bring in some auxiliary members who might be good at a certain area, like publicity
Mm-hmm.
or, et cetera. So it was the four of us that were like, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going. This was Emma's idea, and I agree with her on this. She said, if we're trying to make change happen in France, we need to give it a French name so that traction happens there. And she said, let's call it Le Tour Entier, which is French for the whole tour, as in women belong at the
Mm.
whole tour, right? It's like, oh, okay, yes. So we decided, now we're going back, by the way, this is all happening in like late 2012, early 2013. And we decided that
Mm-hmm.
launching a petition is the best way to go. Change.org was still relatively new. It'd been around for a few years. It was relatively new. And we also knew that we needed more. It couldn't just be a petition, but we needed a website, a manifesto, if you
Mm-hmm.
will, explaining it all. Because when all of the internet people would be like, well, what about this? What about that? Would we want to spend our entire day on Twitter and Facebook, or would we want to be able to say, read here what it's all about? And of course,
Per my previous email.
yes, exactly, exactly. Oh my gosh. But we have to think along those lines too. What if we get traction in the press? Let's give them a place where they
Mm-hmm.
can go, as opposed to,
Mm-hmm.
just to gather all the info. So we did that. We knew that, and we went through many, many drafts of what would become our website, our mission statement, everything. And then we did so many drafts of the actual change.org petition as well. And we made the plan that we would announce or release this petition during middle of July 2020, sorry, middle of July 2013, during the men's Tour de France. Because if it's going to gain
Mm-hmm.
traction, let's, put this out and maybe disrupt the cycle a little bit.
Strike while the iron is hot.
Striking the iron. Exactly. And so what's
Yeah.
funny is that, and I was keeping track of change.org petitions. And I was like, oh, this would be really successful. What if we get like a few hundred signatures, maybe even 1,000? Then
Mm-hmm.
this could do something. And I remember too, launching this petition, one person's name goes on the top of the petition. So that was my name that was going on, even though I was representing
Mm-hmm.
the entire group of us. And the other thing was there was this tiny little box that you could check that said, if you want anyone who signs this petition, an email will then go to your intended target of this petition. And of course, that was ASO, the parent
Oh,
company of the Tour
wow.
de France. So I checked yes, and I, put in the email address for Christian Prudhomme. And so here I am like, oh,
Wait, wait, wait.
maybe.
Quick pause. Who's
Yeah,
Christian Prudhomme for our listeners?
sorry. Christian Prudhomme is the head of ASO. He is the one who puts on the Tour de France. He is the point person. You could
The big
say
boss.
the big boss, the race director, the one who Tour de France goes through, basically. So I kept thinking, like, wouldn't it be great? Maybe he'll get a couple hundred emails in his inbox. We're going to make change happen. Well, we launched that petition, and the most amazing, beautiful thing happened. It went viral in its day and age, and we got almost 100,000 signatures, which is beyond the norm. For now, change.org is different. It's a little easier to sign, click, and share. But back then, 100,000 launched us into the top 3 petitions of the year. That
That's a lot of
Oh,
emails.
that's a lot of emails.
That's a very cluttered inbox.
Guess who wasn't too happy with me about that? Yeah. Right.
Oh, man. This
Christian
is stuff of nightmares, right?
Oh, totally. And not only is that happening, but it's happening during the Tour de France that his inbox is getting stuck. And the most wonderful thing was that the media took note. And I think that's the most important aspect. If you want to create change, be ready and willing and able and very friendly and talking with journalists, because they're your most valid ally in this whole fight. So boy, did things erupt and blow up in the best possible way. And like change.org was calling, they translated the petition into umpteen different languages. And then we're getting media
Oh,
calls from
wow.
like BBC, CNN, NHK, Japan, across the world. All of the major news hubs were coming.
Yeah.
And I was fielding the majority of that because it was my name at the top. Though I was always very, very careful to make sure that people knew this was a team effort. This wasn't. Yes, I might have been the organizer and the main cog in this wheel, but none of that would have happened without Emma, Chrissy, Marianne, and everybody who signed that petition. So always
Yeah.
made sure that they were very recognizably attached. And I loved it. Sometimes it would happen, like the British papers would be like, Emma, Chrissy, Marianne, and some lady we don't know in Tucson, because they were all the superstars, and then some rando over there in the desert. So, but it worked and it happened. And then the media, when they got involved, of course, they went right to Prudhomme and saying, are we going to talk about this? Are you going to talk to the women of La Tour Entier? That was the goal of the petition, was to have a sit down meeting. I think it's very important for people if they're going to make change that they understand that the wrong way to make change is to say, hey, this thing over here, it's unequal. You better change it. The right way to go about making change is saying, hey, this thing over here is unequal. Let's sit down together and build a platform to create change together, to actually be part of that. Don't put the onus on them to do something. No, come in with a game plan and make sure that that plan is attainable and that you are also going to invest and work on that. So that was our mission with the petition, was we want to sit down with you in France and talk about the best strategic way to go about getting women back to the tour. We want to work with you, not dump this in your lap, right?
So you moved them from a position of being adversaries to a position of being collaborators.
Yes. And of course, they're like, we do not want to collaborate with you. Yeah. Sorry, I had to throw the accent in there, which is terrible, but I had to. This is great. It's also slightly ironic, but in a wonderful way, that my last name Bertine, it actually is French. I come from the French lineage. So I'm like, maybe they'll see that favorably. They didn't give a rat's ass about that. But it lets me throw the accent around. But we basically, we finally got to them where they did not respond to the media, but they reached out to our point person in terms of the communication, saying, okay, we will meet with you in France, but you cannot tell anybody about this. And
So when
we
they
said,
say meet with you, meet with the four of you that comprise Le Tour Entier.
absolutely, the four of
Okay.
us. And then we also had some auxiliary members who came in, women who helped us set up
Nice.
meetings. Yeah, it was so amazing. But this was going, so this is, in July, somewhere in August, they reached out to us and we set up a meeting for October 1st, which was like basically the day after World Championships, which was happening that year in Florence, Italy, which so wonderfully, Mariana Voss won. And then she got in her family caravan. I got on a midnight train and we drove slash trained from, from Florence to Paris to have this meeting. Emma took the channel over from England, or Chrissy did. I mean, we got there in secret, but they were so policing our social media to make sure we didn't say anything about this meeting.
Ooh.
Oh yeah, I remember the day of the meeting. I put out this very anonymous tweet saying, interesting things are happening today. And they reached out, they're like, take that down. Like, Kathryn, take
It's
down
so big.
I know, like it's like saying it's gonna be sunny later.
Yeah.
They didn't care. They're like, take that down. I was like, all right. But that's
That's so funny.
how policing they were about the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
But from the meeting, what ended up happening was they said, okay, let's do this. Let's make a Tour de France happen for women. Again, keep in mind, this is October of 2013. And they're like, let's do it. We can make something happen in 2014. And of course, our mission was always from the get-go, we want the same distance, the same days as the men. And they said, well, we can do one day next year to just test the waters to see if anyone will watch. And we're like, great, we've got our foot in the door. One day it is, but it said, but to make this race sustainable, to watch it grow, you need to add 3 to 5 days each year.
Right.
To build on your one day. They're like, yeah, okay, but let's just get this one day. We don't know if anyone will watch. And we're all like, everyone's going to watch. We promise. You're cycling fans. I said, I can tell you that 100,000 people are going to watch because they all signed the petition.
Right. You have the petition in your hand right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all of the donors who made Half the Road, the film, a reality, they're all going to watch. 16 countries donated to Half the Road, half the split between men and women. So you're off to a great start, but we're going to get even bigger. And so for the rest of the winter and spring, we created La Course by Tour de France. And that's what's really huge, is that it wasn't just La Course. It was La Course by Tour de France. We finally had naming rights back to this race that once upon a time, ASO said, you may not use the name Tour de France. When they took it away, when they took the tour away in 1989, and the women were like, well, we'll just make our own. Yeah, from them, they're like, we'll make our own Tour de France. And ASO back then said, no, you don't have access to the name Tour de France. You can't have it. That's ours.
Right.
So they really effectively banned women from ever using the name Tour de France. So for us to create La Course by Tour de France, 20 plus years, 30 years later, they were like, that was the biggest victory that we had. And, it was incredible. I got to stand on the start line of my dreams that year. That's a whole other chapter and episode. But to be there and to race it with Mariana Voss and Emma Pooley were both there. Christy was there cheering from the sidelines, being part of the event. But the three of us were there with our respective teams. And then, of course, for, the golden moment, Mariana Voss won.
Yeah.
So that was huge, and our dear friend Leah Kirchman was on the podium in third. So it was just so cool that it all transpired. And the upside was that the viewership came in and everybody watched, something like 126 countries and 56 different networks broadcast La Course, and it turned a pretty penny up in terms of sponsorship toward ASO. So that was great. And so we were like, okay, next year we got to add on, a few more days. And they're like, this was so successful. We're doing it again. We've already signed. You'll do one day next year. Yeah. I'm like, oh my God. Okay. So long story short, the great part is La Course by Tour de France ran for 8 years. Sometimes it was one day. Sometimes it was 2 days. It was in the mountains. It was in Paris. It shifted around. We kept the pressure on that, like, okay, now that we've proven that one day is successful over 8 years, we need this to grow. And so after 8 years of the race being one day And luckily the media was so on our side. They're like, okay, enough of this one day stuff. We really need to see change happen. And it wasn't like it was just my voice anymore or
Hmm.
Latour Antier's voice. It was the media. It was all the current athletes. They're like, we need this race to grow. And Zwift stepped up and they became a title sponsor of Tour. What would go from La Course by Tour de France was renamed Tour de France
Hmm.
Femme, and it became an 8-day race. And we have now had that in the running for what will become the third year
It's
this
amazing.
August. So huge progress, huge progress. And I always use this junction to say, like, we collectively need to be very thankful for this progress. However, it's
Right.
not equal yet. And it's 8 days, whereas the men still have
Hmm.
21 days. The women have shorter distances than the men, largely due to the fact that ASO just doesn't believe that women can effectively do the same distance. And a lot of people will say, yeah, but you know what? Actually, the women's races are a lot more
Hmm.
exciting when they're a little bit shorter. It's more active. And I'm like, I totally agree. So, like, why don't we make the men's race shorter too?
They did that one year, and I'm blanking on which year it was, but there was a year where they added in a few shorter stages to the tour, and
Mhm.
people loved them. And
They loved
they were
it.
so shocked. Wow, these stages were so much more exciting and dynamic. And it's because, when the distance is a little bit
Mhm.
shorter, and most women's races are shorter than the men's,
Yep.
you actually can physiologically put in more attacks and have more dynamism and be less concerned about conserving energy in the race. And oftentimes the really, really
Yeah.
long stages, I mean, the distances sound really impressive, but when you actually look at the race dynamics and the tactics that are playing out, the racers themselves have to be more conservative to account for the longer distances, even the men. And so when they shorten the distances, it makes for these much more dynamic and exciting races. And it was so funny to see everyone excited about the shorter distances for the men. And we're over here going like, hey, that's kind of like our whole sport over here.
Yeah, tune in and watch the women kick ass at the slightly shorter distances.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the name of the show is the Be a Good Wheel podcast. And in so many ways, Kathryn, you've been not only a good wheel for me, and I thank you for that, but also a good wheel for all of the women and men coming up through the Homestretch Foundation, and all of the women in sport who, will feel the impact of the change that you've been able to affect with the ASO and the Tour de France. And as we know, that is a huge ripple effect. I mean, that journey is ongoing, obviously, but it's already had such a huge impact and will continue to have that kind of impact. So thank you for being a good wheel to me and for so many others.
Oh my goodness, Amber, the pleasure is mine. Thank you for being an amazing wheel and for being the good wheel that leads us to the right wheels for all of us. Like I remember when you were talking about the concept of be a good wheel way before the podcast became this amazing reality.
Yeah.
And I'm just so proud and honored to know you and for preaching the good wheel and putting that into the universe because it is so important that we all learn how to be a good wheel. So thank you for all that you do.
Well, I thank you. And with that, I'll say thank you so much for joining us on the show today. And we will hope to have you on again in the future, because actually, before we go, what is on the horizon for you? I know there's got to be some kind of a project in the works that hasn't maybe been announced yet, or what can we tease right now?
Oh, okay. A little quick teaser. I
Yes.
promise it'll be a short answer because I hope we can talk about it in longer form.
Yes.
A couple years from now, it's actually out. I am working on a new book.
Yes.
It's the journey of high pointing, of going to the highest point in each state. It was a journey that I started with my dad during his lifetime and continued after he passed.
Mm.
And again, it's not really about the mountains, but about the journey that's how we go on in this life. And I'm so excited to teach people about high pointing. I'm currently writing this book. So, this won't be out for another couple
Mm-hmm.
years. And I look forward to telling you more about this when it is out. And oh my gosh, if time flies as fast as it has been, it'll feel like we'll talk again tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just so everybody knows, high pointing is hiking to the highest point in every state in the United States. Do I have that correct?
You do. Thank you for clarifying that. It's hiking to the highest point. Now, sometimes that's a sidewalk,
Hmm.
like in Delaware, or a field in Florida, or maybe it's Denali in Alaska. So, the high points can be anywhere from sidewalks to mountains. And it's a thing. You can look it up at the High Pointers organization. Now happen to be a board member because I love this group so much.
Of course you
So,
are.
and I can't wait to tell you all. Right? Well, it's so great. I can't wait to. It's actually the big soul of this book. We'll be talking about the High Pointers organization. How did it all start? What is its journey? So,
That's so neat.
Stay tuned for lots of fun stories within the story.
Well, I got to join Kathryn on one of her High Point adventures. I was 8 months pregnant. I was huge, and we hiked all of 10 minutes to the High Point in Rhode Island.
That's right. Jarneth Hill, Rhode Island, you and Berkeley in utero. She is now a High Pointer as well. It was such an amazing day.
Oh, that was so much fun.
And we brought that High Point to Victoria's standing. We stood at the High Point of Rhode Island. It was. I can't wait to. That's going to get a very special shout out, and I'm so thankful you're a part of that journey.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn. It's been an absolute pleasure, and really looking forward to speaking to you again at some point on the show.
Thank you for all you do, Amber.
Bye, everyone. One of the things I admire about Kathryn is how at every step of her journey, she did what she could with what she had. She never waited until she had a bigger platform, better results, more money, or had met some other made-up criteria before she started doing something about the problems she witnessed. Nope, she leveraged what she had for the benefit of others. She didn't wait to land a deal with a production company to start making her documentary. She raised the money herself from countless individual donations and did the thing. She didn't wait until she had a formal introduction to ASO. She made a business plan and emailed it to them. When that didn't work, she started a petition. While our conversation today covered a lot of ground, I hope you're left with this conviction. You don't have to be anything more than you are now. You don't have to have anything more than you have now to start doing the thing that you see needs to be done. What have you been reluctant to begin? What assumptions have stood in your way, and how could you begin right now, just as you are? Who could you rally to join you? Whether it's organizing a new group ride or fighting for equality, you really can do something right now. And your efforts really can make a difference. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you loved today's show, remember to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. The Be a Good Wheel podcast is produced by our wizard behind the curtain, Maxine Philivong. Find all published episodes and sign up for our newsletter at beagoodwheel.com. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. Support for the show comes entirely from listeners like you. Sign up on Ko-Fi to get extended guest interviews, bonus episodes, official Be a Good Wheel merch, and more. Go to ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel and help us keep the show going. That's Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/beagoodwheel. Until next time, thanks for listening, and thanks for being a good wheel.